Somewhere in the high desert of the American Southwest, there are buildings that have stood empty for 800 years. Perfect masonry, 5 stories tall, aligned with the stars, and completely abandoned. The textbooks will tell you a civilization vanished here, a peaceful farming people who built one of the most sophisticated cultures in pre-Columbian North America, then simply disappeared around 1200 AD. For a century and a half, that was the story, a mystery with no ending. So I asked Grok to lay out what we actually know, and the answer was not what the textbooks promised. Because then ancient DNA was extracted from the bones they left behind. And when the results came back, almost every part of that story fell apart. The Anasazi were never who we were told they were, and stranger than that, they never actually vanished. To understand what the DNA overturned, you first have to understand what it was overturning. Chaco Canyon sits in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, a shallow cut of sandstone about 9 miles long, surrounded by nothing, no river of any consequence, no fertile valley, no obvious reason, looking at it today, why anyone would build anything there at all. And yet between roughly 850 AD and 1150 AD, this barren stretch of rock became the political, religious, and architectural center of a civilization that stretched across 90,000 square miles, an area larger than Ireland. They built great houses, more than 150 of them, massive stone structures rising up to 5 stories, some containing over 600 rooms, constructed with a standard of masonry that modern builders still find difficult to replicate. The walls were engineered with interior rubble cores faced in precisely cut sandstone veneer. Not piled. Engineered. The rooms were laid out to track the movements of the sun and the moon across cycles that lasted decades. On a rock face called Fajada Butte, a spiral carved into the stone marked the summer solstice to within a matter of minutes. This was not decoration, this was a calendar built into a cliff. And they connected all of it. A network of roads, some of them 30 feet wide, ran in perfectly straight lines across the canyon country for hundreds of miles. These were not trade routes in any ordinary sense. They climbed cliffs rather than going around them. They ignored the terrain entirely. A road that refuses to bend for a mountain is not a road built to move goods. It was built to say something about the people who made it, to declare an order onto the landscape itself. At the center of it all sat the kivas, circular, sunken, ceremonial chambers built into the heart of every great house. Some small, some large enough to hold hundreds of people at a time. These were the gathering places, the altars, the rooms where whatever held this civilization together was reinforced, generation after generation, for nearly 300 years. By every measurable standard, Chaco was extraordinary. The planning, the engineering, the astronomical precision, the sheer scale of coordinated labor required to quarry, haul, and raise all that stone in a place with no water and no easy food. This was not a scattering of villages that happened to share a style of pottery. This was something larger, something organized, something with a center of gravity, pulling people and materials and devotion inward across an entire region. And then, around 1200 AD, it ended. Not gradually, not slowly. The great houses were abandoned within a few generations. The roads fell silent. The population that had built and maintained one of the most ambitious construction projects in prehistoric North America simply walked away and left it all standing. Perfect masonry, 5-story walls, ceremonial chambers still full of ritual objects, turquoise still in the ground where it had been buried, all of it empty. Think about what that actually means. People do not usually abandon a cathedral. They do not walk out of the most important place in their world and leave the doors open behind them. And yet, that is precisely what appears to have happened here, across 90,000 square miles in the span of a few short generations. For a long time, this was treated as one of the great mysteries of American archaeology. What had happened here? Where had everyone gone? The answer that settled into the textbooks would turn out to be almost entirely wrong. But to see why, you have to understand the story they told instead. The answer that settled into textbooks across the 20th century was reassuring. A peaceful farming civilization, democratic, egalitarian, very nearly utopian. A people who worshipped the sun and the corn and the turning of the seasons, who lived in harmony with the land and with each other, and who, for reasons no one could quite explain, eventually dispersed into the wider desert and faded from history. They were given a name borrowed from the Navajo language, Anasazi, a word now understood to carry uncomfortable connotations, which is why many archaeologists today prefer the term ancestral Puebloan. But for most of the last 100 years, Anasazi was the name attached to the mystery, and the mystery had a tidy shape. A civilization rise, a civilization vanished. Here are the ruins they left behind. That was the story. It was the story in the museums. It was the story in the documentaries. It was the story taught to generations of school children and repeated with confidence in scholarly textbooks. Peaceful farmers, lost civilization, vanished people. 3 phrases that fit neatly on a placard beside a photograph of an empty doorway. The problem is that nearly every part of that story was built before anyone could read the bones, before ancient DNA analysis existed, before forensic taphonomy existed as a rigorous discipline, before anyone had sequenced the genetic material from the skeletons buried beneath those great houses and compared them to the populations living across the Southwest today. The textbook version of the Anasazi was constructed from pottery, from architecture, and from a great deal of wishful thinking. It was a story written in the absence of the single most important piece of evidence: the people themselves. And it is worth pausing on what that absence actually meant. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists studied the Anasazi the only way they could. They examined pottery fragments, they measured walls, they studied the shape of a corn-grinding stone or the style of a ceremonial vessel, and from those fragments they built elaborate theories about who these people had been and how they had lived. When they consulted the oral traditions of the descendant communities at all, those traditions were rarely treated as evidence. They were treated as folklore, as stories, as something other than fact. These were not careless people. They were doing the best they could with the tools available. But the bones themselves, the actual biological record of who these people were, where they came from, and how they were related to the living, sat in museum drawers, largely unread, for the better part of a century. So what is ancient DNA exactly? It is precisely what it sounds like. Scientists extract genetic material from skeletal remains that have been in the ground for hundreds or even thousands of years. They sequence it against modern genomes. And from that, they build a detailed biological portrait of who those people were, where their ancestors came from, and how they connect to the populations still living today. It is, in every meaningful sense, a time machine made of bone. A way of asking the dead a direct question and getting a direct answer. For most of the 20th century, this was simply impossible. The technology did not exist. The bones kept their secrets. Then, in the 2010s, ancient DNA sequencing reached a level of precision that finally allowed researchers to pull readable genetic material from those century-old skeletons. And when that evidence arrived, it did not gently revise the textbook version of the Anasazi. It took the whole thing apart, and the first crack appeared inside a single sealed room. The room is called Room 33. It sits inside Pueblo Bonito, the grandest great house in the canyon, and it is one of the most elaborate burial crypts ever found in the entire Pueblo world. A small chamber, walled off, hidden in the heart of an enormous building. And what was inside it had been waiting in museum collections since the 1890s. In 2017, a team of researchers led by Douglas Kennett and Stephen Plogg finally sequenced the remains. The results were published in the journal Nature Communications, and they were not what anyone expected. 9 of the individuals buried in that chamber carried identical mitochondrial genomes. The same maternal signature, a haplotype known as B2Y1, passed unbroken from mother to child, and radiocarbon dating placed those burials across roughly 330 years, almost exactly the lifespan of the civilization itself. Let that settle for a moment. These were not 9 people who happened to be buried together. They were 9 members of a single bloodline, related through their mothers, interred in the same sacred room across more than 3 centuries. The nuclear DNA went further still, identifying a mother and her daughter, and a grandmother and her grandson lying in the same crypt. This was not a random cross-section of the Chacoan population. This was a matriline, a hereditary ruling lineage that had buried its dead in the same chamber, in the same great house, for the entire span of Chaco's rise. And the objects buried with them told the same story. Thousands of pieces of turquoise, conch shell trumpets carried inland from the Pacific coast, the remains of scarlet macaws, birds that live only in the tropical lowlands far to the south. These were not the grave goods of equal citizens in a democratic farming community. These were the treasures of a hereditary elite, a ruling class that had held power in Chaco for generations. The textbooks had described a people without kings. The DNA described a dynasty. Now, the careful researchers were quick to note the limits of what 9 skeletons can prove. A single sealed room does not, on its own, demonstrate that a maternal dynasty ruled the entire canyon, and some specialists have argued precisely that. Perhaps Room 33 simply held one prominent family rather than the founding line of a kingdom. That caution is fair, and it is worth keeping in mind. But even the most conservative reading of the evidence breaks the old picture. Because a society that reserves its most exotic treasures, its most sacred space, and 3 unbroken centuries of burial for a single bloodline is not an egalitarian society. It is a society with a top, and someone was sitting on it. Which raises the question that genuinely unsettled the field. Not whether there were elites at Chaco. The crypt had answered that. The question was where these people, and the extraordinary ideas they carried, had actually come from. Because the matriline in Room 33 did not look like the slow, gradual product of local farmers slowly organizing themselves over centuries, it looked like something that had arrived. A ruling concept, fully formed, planted at the very top of Chacoan society, and held there with remarkable discipline for 300 years. When researchers began comparing the broader Chacoan genetic profile to the populations surrounding it, something in the data refused to line up. There were signals in those elite burials that did not match the desert around them. Signals that seemed to point somewhere else entirely, somewhere far to the south. And following them would lead to a far darker possibility. Here is where the story leaves solid ground and enters contested territory, and it is important to be honest about that as we go. What follows is not settled fact. It is a hypothesis, advanced by some researchers and disputed by others, and the genetic evidence behind it is far thinner than the headlines have sometimes suggested, but it is a hypothesis built on real objects, and those objects are worth examining. The argument goes like this. The cultural fingerprints at Chaco point south, 1,000 miles south, to the great civilizations of Mesoamerica in what is now central Mexico. And the trade goods are not in dispute. Scarlet macaw feathers from the tropical lowlands, copper bells cast using the metallurgy traditions of the Mesoamerican world, cacao residue identified by biochemical analysis of the inside of cylindrical drinking vessels from a plant that grows only in the deep tropics, more than 1,000 miles away. These things were at Chaco. They were carried there by someone across an enormous distance with deliberate purpose. Then there is the architecture, which is harder to explain away. At Wupatki, on the western edge of the Chacoan world, archaeologists found a ball court, not something resembling one. An actual Mesoamerican-style ball court, of the kind used for the ritual games played across the Valley of Mexico for over 1,000 years. There was no tradition of ball courts anywhere else in the Southwest, no local evolution that could account for it. And inside Chaco Canyon itself, at a great house called Quetzalcoatl, someone built a colonnade, a row of columns along a ceremonial wall matching the architectural style of Mesoamerican temples to the south. No one else in the surrounding desert was building anything like it. And at some point later, someone filled those columns in as if the signature had become something to hide. And then came the tooth. In the elite burials of Pueblo Bonito, researchers found a single filed tooth, a specific style of dental modification shaped and notched in a pattern common across Mesoamerica and completely unknown anywhere north of Mexico. Not in the Southwest, not in the Great Basin, not on the plains, a signature that could only have been carried north inside the mouth of a person who had been born and raised 1,000 miles away. From these threads, some researchers assembled a striking picture, a small group arriving at Chaco around 900 AD. Not refugees, but carriers of knowledge. Architectural knowledge, astronomical knowledge, religious knowledge, people who did not come as equals, but who installed themselves at the very top of whatever society already existed and built something unprecedented upon it. Now the honest counterweight, because it matters. The peer-reviewed DNA studies do not confirm a Mesoamerican migration into the Chacoan elite. That part remains unproven. Mainstream archaeology accepts that Mesoamerican influence reached Chaco through trade and contact. It does not accept, on present evidence, that a foreign ruling class physically moved in and seized power. The objects are real. The interpretation built on top of them is a story, and a debated one. It is entirely possible that ambitious local people adopted these distant ideas and goods to amplify their own authority without a single Southerner ever setting foot in the canyon. But the migration hypothesis has a darker dimension that its supporters point to insistently. Because the template these objects seem to echo, the theocratic model of the Valley of Mexico, did not travel light. Whatever arrived at Chaco, the world it came from carried something with it, and the bones beneath the great houses would soon suggest what. For most of the 20th century, one physical anthropologist stood almost alone in trying to explain what the Chacoan bones were actually showing. His name was Christy Turner, and for more than 30 years, many of his colleagues wished he would stop. Turner had trained as a forensic consultant. He had worked alongside police investigating homicides. He knew what human bones looked like when a body had been treated gently after death, and he knew what they looked like when a body had been treated as something else entirely. And when he examined the skeletal collections from Chaco and the surrounding great houses, he saw a pattern that did not fit the peaceful farmer narrative at all. He built a forensic checklist, deliberately strict, 6 criteria, all of which had to be present before he would even consider the conclusion. Burning on the backs of skulls, but not the faces, consistent with a headset on a fire. Anvil abrasion, the scraping left when a bone is smashed between 2 stones for its marrow. Cut marks from stone tools at the exact joints where tendon meets bone. Pot polish, a faint sheen left on fragments stirred inside a ceramic vessel. Fracture patterns from breaking fresh bone rather than weathered bone. And the most damning, the systematic absence of the vertebrae, the richest source of marrow in the human body, pulverized and gone. Applied across dozens of Chacoan sites, the checklist returned a number the field could not easily dismiss. Roughly 300 individuals, men, women, and children, whose remains met the full criteria. Processed, Turner argued, the same way these same people processed deer and rabbit. For 20 years, the debate lived in a single gap. Butchering is not the same as eating. A body can be dismembered for punishment or for the destruction of an enemy without anyone consuming the flesh. The bones showed processing. They did not, on their own, show a meal. That gap closed in the year 2000 at a site in southwestern Colorado called Cowboy Wash. Excavators found 7 individuals processed according to every one of Turner's 6 criteria. And in the hearth at the center of the dwelling, they found something new: a coprolite, desiccated human waste preserved by the dry desert air. The biochemist Richard Marlar took it to his laboratory and tested it for human myoglobin, a protein found only in human muscle tissue, which has no business appearing in human waste under any other circumstance. He ran the test repeatedly, with every control. It came back positive. The results were published in the journal Nature. Consumption was no longer a hypothesis, it was a chemical fact. And once accepted, the wider pattern fell into place. Around 1 in 50, Chacoan remains carried the full signature. 90% of those cases clustered in or near the ceremonial centers. The signature appeared as Chaco rose and faded as Chaco fell. But here a line must be drawn carefully, because what those bones mean is not settled, and one researcher's interpretation is not the truth. Turner read this as terror, a weapon of social control. Others read it as warfare or famine or something we do not yet understand. And the Pueblo descendant communities, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the Rio Grande Pueblos, have contested these claims for decades, and with good reason. Accusations of cannibalism have been used throughout history to dehumanize native peoples. Forensic damage can record what happened to a body. It cannot tell us what it meant. That distinction matters. And whatever held Chaco together around 1150, its time ran out. The end did not arrive from a single direction. It arrived from several at once, and the timing of its arrival is one of the most precisely documented transitions in all of North American archaeology. The first signal came from the trees. Tree ring analysis allows researchers to reconstruct rainfall across the Four Corners region year by year, going back more than 1,000 years, and the record is clear. The favorable conditions that had sustained Chacoan farming for the better part of 3 centuries broke in the middle of the 1200. Between roughly 1130 and 1180 AD, the Southwest entered a prolonged drought. Winters turned colder, summers turned drier, and the maize that Chacoan farmers had coaxed from soils and altitudes that should never have supported it began to fail, season after season, in a pattern that lasted long enough to break the agricultural foundation of the entire system. Chaco had always been vulnerable to exactly this. The canyon itself had no reliable water. The great houses and the roads and the ceremonial centers had been sustained by an immense, coordinated effort to haul food and materials inward from the outlying regions. When those regions could no longer produce a surplus, the ritual core lost the ability to feed itself. The tribute stopped flowing. The coordination broke down. And then a second signal appeared, this one written in the bones. The forensic cannibalism signature, present in the Chacoan record for more than 200 years, begins to vanish almost exactly when the drought begins. The latest assemblages cluster tightly around 1150 AD, and after 1180 AD, they essentially stop. Whatever that signature represented, it ended when the system that produced it ended. What the archaeology shows next is unambiguous. The great houses were abandoned, not destroyed, not burned, abandoned. The residents walked away and left their homes standing. By 1200, the depopulation of the canyon was well underway. By 1250, the outlying communities were emptying too. By 1300, the Four Corners region, which had supported one of the most densely organized societies north of Mexico, was effectively empty of people. And this is the precise moment where the textbook narrative has always stopped. The vanishing, the lost civilization, the empty buildings, and the unanswered question of where everyone had gone. But this is also the moment where that narrative has always been wrong, because the depopulation of Chaco was not a disappearance, it was a migration. The people who had lived under the Chacoan system did not vanish into the desert. They moved south and east, following the rivers that still ran, down to the Rio Grande and the Little Colorado, to the valleys where farming was still possible in a drying world. They carried their knowledge with them, their agriculture, their astronomy, their masonry, and they left the ceremonial centers behind, as if those centers had stopped being worth preserving. For more than 6 centuries, the story of where they went survived only in the oral traditions of their descendants, traditions the academic world largely refused to treat as evidence. Then, in 2025, ancient DNA settled it. A study published in Nature, led by the Picurus Pueblo themselves, compared the genomes of living tribal members to ancient individuals from their own land and to the people buried at Chaco. The connection was the strongest yet found. A direct, continuous genetic line running unbroken from the builders of the great houses to people alive today. The Anasazi had not vanished. They had simply been telling us where they were the entire time. So consider what that actually means. A civilization was called lost, while its descendants farmed the same valleys, performed the same ceremonies, and carried in their own bodies the exact biological record of the people who built the great houses. They were called vanished while they were standing in plain sight. The oral traditions told the story accurately for 800 years. The archaeologists simply refused to listen until the DNA said the same thing in a language they were finally willing to accept. Ancient DNA did not rediscover the Anasazi. It confirmed what had never truly been forgotten, except by the people who came later and decided the story needed an ending. And so the real mystery of the American Southwest was never what happened to the people who built Chaco Canyon. The real mystery is how long it took the rest of us to notice that they had been here all along.